Hope the rain did not keep people away, and everybody is, it's lovely to see you all here. So I am Farrah Warner. I'm the Executive Director of Metcalf Institute. You'll hear more about me in a minute, but I'm happy to turn over the lectern to President Mark Parlange.
Thank you, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to see all of you. It's good to see friends who have returned. So thank you for being here, and to our speaker today and many guests. I want to begin, as we always do for official events at the University of Rhode Island, to give the land acknowledgement, which we developed in partnership with the Narragansett tribe. So the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people, and we honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land we too inhabit. Look, I really want to thank all of you for joining us today at URI's Narragansett Bay campus, and many of you that are online. It's a delight for me to be able to welcome you here to the Metcalf Institute's 5th annual Leeson Lecture, which honors Robert Leeson, a longtime advisory board member for Metcalf Institute. He has been a tremendous advocate and a generous supporter of the Institute's mission. In honor of Rob, a group of more than 140 donors endowed the annual Robert Leeson Jr. Lecture. And this series has allowed the Metcalf Institute to bring really incredible guest lecturers to URI, including our speaker today from across the country and around the world, to discuss topics of pressing global importance. And this afternoon, we will learn how to listen to water and efforts by people engaged in the slow water movement to rebalance our relationship to water, which is clearly the most critical resource on Earth. And so Rhode Island has more than 420 miles of coastline, and it's really, if ever there was a place, it's the perfect place to listen to water. We are surrounded by the ocean. We have dozens of rivers, streams, and brooks running through our state. And for those of you who have seen it, or those of you who have not seen it, I strongly recommend that you look at the URI magazine, which really talks about the importance of water in the state of Rhode Island. So we have obviously lakes and ponds and marshes and bogs and swamps and estuaries. We have turtles that are coming out. So if you go running on the bike path, you will see some very large turtles. Our state is also an important place to hold critical conversations about water systems and the pressure they face as our climate changes. And this is one of the beauties about the University of Rhode Island. It is a place where we can have important conversations about research in this area. Rhode Islanders are feeling in many different ways the effects of climate change and the warming of the planet. And the connections between our water systems and climate is at this year's annual immersion workshop for journalists. I think we might be hearing a little bit more about that. But I just want to say that we have many colleagues. Years ago, when I applied to the University of Rhode Island, I always knew how strong URI was in the area of climate, hydrology, ocean, and so forth. So we have colleagues that are working on the mitigation of stormwater runoff, through all kinds of nature-based responses to the effect of warming oceans in our fishing industry. It's interesting. If we actually go back in time, our rivers were dammed early in Rhode Island when it was a young country, and we were really starting, if you will, the Industrial Revolution. And obviously today we have all kinds of infrastructure in place, and we have polluted waters in other places due to the impacts that people have had on the landscape. Our bays, our coastline are extremely important to us as a foundation for the fishing industry, and obviously our very thriving tourist industry. And so there's a very natural connection between the natural world and the need for a vibrant economy, but also understanding those connections in the face of climate change. And so that's why we are here this afternoon to have important conversations with journalists, the public, fellow researchers, industry, government, friends of the university. So highlighting and sharing this work informs decision-making, policy-making, and it also inspires action. And the Metcalf Institute is a key player in this communication, both here at URI and around the world. And so I'm really pleased to join you here this evening and to introduce now Farah Warner, Metcalf Institute's Executive Director, who can share more about the Institute's work and tonight's guest speaker. Farah?
Thank you. Thank you so much, President Pralange. Thank you. And a big thank you as well to Rob and Peggy Leeson for your support of the Metcalf Institute and all of these Leeson Lectures. So this year marks the 26th year that Metcalf has been advancing public conversations about climate change and other environmental issues with its training for professional journalists. So I'd just like to shout out the 2024 fellows, if you'll all just raise your hands. I know you're all, they're like, they've already become sort of like a crew, like they hang out together, they do things together. I think this is my first class of fellows, and they will always have a place in my heart. And I get very emotional, so I'm sorry if I start, like tears and things like that. Don't worry, I'm fine. I'm fine. So this early afternoon, they spent some time in the Chaffee Wildlife Refuge monitoring marsh elevations and species in that absolutely beautiful spot, rainy though it probably was, with URI scientists, policymakers from Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, people from Save the Bay, Rhode Island Natural History Survey, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I say that because I think this shows the power of the Metcalf Institute to convene conversations with many different types of people who either have a connection to this campus or are deeply engaged in the work that happens on this campus and also in Rhode Island. So this marks the first year, as I've said, as Executive Director of Metcalf Institute. For me, it is my honor to lead this institute that has connected more than 3,000 journalists, scientists, communicators, and the public throughout its history. Importantly, by conducting science training for reporters across the country and around the globe. We have three of our fellows are from outside the United States. We have representation from Brazil, the Philippines, and the UK. So this is also a global training, not just Southern New England and not just the United States. And importantly, we're also taking on the other challenge of addressing the other side of the communication continuum. So it's not just journalists, but it's also scientists. So we do training with scientists, science communicators, and others in academia, business, and other fields to help them bring their work to the public through our important training in inclusive science communication. Our work is invaluable for understanding and solving pressing global challenges, and there is ever greater need and demand for our work. The effects of climate change are no longer far away, nor are they far into the future. They are now, and they are on our doorstep. And for some of us, they're flooding our basements. So temperatures in India reached 50 degrees Celsius last week, or 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat waves are already starting in the United States this coming week. Sea levels are rising at rapid rates, and the world's oceans are warming at an alarming rate. We are faced with wildfire seasons that last half a year and droughts that are called mega. Cities and towns across the world are running out of water even as their aging infrastructure cannot handle extreme rains that cause devastating flooding, which we are all too aware of here in Rhode Island. This is why Metcalf and its mission to advance the public's understanding of climate and environment science is so critical right now. And it is why I'm so honored and excited to move this work forward by increasing our ability to train many more journalists in the coming year. I love that we train 10 journalists a year. I'd like to train 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. But of course, this all takes money. And I also want to say that our inclusive science communication work will also advance as we increase our outreach and connection to this important community, the scientific community. Our goal is that inclusive science communication is not outside of traditional science communication, but in fact becomes the way we do science communication. These efforts will take time and, of course, resources. And I wouldn't be an executive director if I didn't say I hope you take a moment to make a gift to the Metcalf Institute through our Rhody Now campaign and to help meet the demand for this work. Your support makes possible public programs like this one. Our diverse training opportunities catalyze conversations and move communities to take action at a time when we need to understand the problems we face, but also understand how we create, invest in, and move forward the responses and the solutions we need to mitigate, adapt, and be responsive to climate change and the other critical environmental issues we face. Now it is my honor to introduce Erica Gies, author and science journalist who has traveled the world reporting on water for her powerful book, Water Always Wins, Thriving in the Age of Drought and Deluge. I will say that we will take questions after Erica's lecture, both here in the room, and also we are live streaming this on YouTube, and you can put your questions in the chat function there, and we will also take questions. I also, in keeping with inclusive science communication, really call on any young people in the room, any people who don't often stand up and ask questions, please. The floor will be yours in a little while. Erica's work reminds me of two critical books that I read as I was growing up in Utah. They were critical to my understanding of water. Cadillac Desert, The American West and Its Disappearing Water, which was written in 1993 by Mark Reisner, and The Control of Nature by the amazing author John McPhee, one of my favorites. They were powerful and memorable, but those books focused on the problems and the peril of our control of water. They gave me little to hold on to other than anger and sadness. In Water Always Wins, see, I start getting like water just makes me want to cry. In Water Always Wins, Erica takes us to places on Earth where water detectives, as she so wonderfully calls them, are learning to work with water, in fact, to listen to water, to shift us away from control to connection and being in community with water. In Peru, she hiked the Andes to chronicle the work of researchers and communities to protect, restore, and rebuild ancient systems that bring water from the high reaches of the Andes. In the US, she writes brilliantly about the efforts of beavers to be brought back to our rivers after being killed in the millions in the 1700s as capitalism and colonialism combined to dramatically change our natural landscape for the sake of hats and coats. She takes us to China, Kenya, India, and many other places to show us what happens when we understand water, when we stop fighting, and we importantly start to slow down. So before I give away too much, it's my pleasure to invite to the stage Erica Gies.
Howdy. I'm so happy to be here today. Can you guys hear me? I think I turned this on. Yeah, it's really beautiful around here, and I had a great day yesterday out at the water and the sunshine. So as Farah was talking about, I think we're all familiar with the rapid increase of flood and drought around the world and the intensification. And what I want to talk about today is the pressing need to change the dominant narrative and culture of how we relate to water. And by that, I mean the Euro-North American context that's been exported around the world via colonialism and now capitalism. And that tends to think of water either as a commodity or a threat. And with that lens, we try to control it. So typically in the dominant culture, we respond to disasters by calling for more infrastructure, more control. We often hear our infrastructure wasn't built for these extremes. But with population growth, environmental destruction, and climate change, these attempts at control are failing increasingly often. And when we drill down into why, The dominant culture is really centered on humans as most important. And that leads to a single focus problem solving. So if you're worried about flooding, you build a levee. If you're concerned about scarcity, you build a dam and bring in water from somewhere else. But putting ourselves first in this simplistic way isn't working because our interventions ignore water's agency and complex relationships with soil and rock and microbes and plants and beavers and people, and therefore undermine them. But what I learned in traveling around the world, talking to the water detectives, is that not all humans think this way. Many indigenous and traditional cultures view water not as a what, a thing, but a who, a friend or a relative, which allows them to better understand water's relationships and understand that with rights to Earth's bounty comes a responsibility for caretaking. So in researching my book, I traveled to Washington State, California, China, Iraq, Peru, Kenya, England. And in all these places, I met people who are innovating ways to work with water to reduce drought and flood. It doesn't seem to be working. Nope. Can you help me with this guy? Oh, now it goes. Oh, the down one? Okay, thank you. So, this woman I met in the Mesopotamian marshes of Iraq, and she is from the Medan culture, which has a 9,000-year-old heritage of living with water in what is thought to be the biblical Garden of Eden. And to the Medan, water is life. And everything that they have there, they built with Phragmites australis, this giant grass, which is invasive elsewhere, but is native to this area. They raise water buffalo for cheese and milk. They also fish, and they trade with people on land for fruit and veg. This style of house is largely unchanged for thousands of years. They travel around in these mashufs, these long, narrow canoes. And Saddam Hussein drained these marshes in retaliation to some of his enemies who are hiding out there. And that forced them to move into Babylon and Baghdad, living on land for the first time. And when Saddam fell, they went back, they busted holes in these levees, and the water retook its marshes, which is something that has happened again and again throughout time. Many, many irrigated civilizations have risen and fallen in this area. And when they do, the water retakes its marshes. And this is their community center called the Mudif, also built with Phragmites. And the longevity of this culture really pales in comparison to North American culture, dominant North American culture. And the way that they relate to water, I think, is part of it. So these pictures are both from California, 2 years apart. So why is climate change causing more intense flood and drought? For every degree Celsius warming, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water, which is why we're seeing bigger storms. And it's possible that that also makes the atmosphere thirstier over dry areas. These trends were predicted by climate scientists decades ago, and we're seeing them now. But importantly, it's not just climate change that is causing these disasters. I've been a climate journalist long enough to remember when people in the United States were denying that it was happening. And then it was like, well, it's happening, but we're not causing it. And then it was like, oh, okay, we're causing it. And the answer is to reduce carbon dioxide to get off fossil fuels. And those things are very important. But in kind of simplifying that message to get it out there, we've lost a very important piece of the puzzle, which is the really dramatic impact that the water cycle has on climate in stabilizing and regulating it, or not doing so when we interrupt the water cycle. So And then there's one other massive cause of flood and drought that gets very little attention, which is our development. So we often think the answer is more infrastructure, but in fact, urban sprawl, industrial, ag, and forestry, and the very kind of concrete control-oriented way that we try to manage water are actually making all of these problems much worse. So when I say, and this is a nod to John McPhee, the scale at which we've altered the water cycle globally is absolutely massive. We have drained or filled as much as 87% of the world's wetlands. We've dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's large rivers. Just since 1992, the land area in our cities covered by pavement has doubled. Deforestation is increasing rainfall, decreasing rainfall locally, regionally, and globally. Is possibly a factor in increasing severity of hurricanes. And the drier areas that we're experiencing drought, the land has been desiccated by killing the beavers, by overgrazing, by deforestation, and by channeling rivers and cutting them off from their floodplains and wetlands. So instead of that kind of single focus problem solving, the water detectives that I met around the world are asking a different question. They're asking, what does water want? And what I've come to understand is that what water wants is a return of its slow phases that are particularly prone to our disruption with development. So I came to think of these practitioners as members of the global slow water movement. And basically that's protecting and restoring wetlands, floodplains, water towers, forests, meadows, bioswales. And like the slow food movement, these solutions are unique to each place. Water is local. Every place has unique geology, ecology, and culture. It deploys systems thinking instead of single focus problem solving. It's ideally local, helping people to understand the local water cycle and availability and work within it. It's socially just. So I think people may be familiar with the idea that a levee might protect one community, but because it's cutting the river off from its floodplain, it's raising the water level in the river, so that makes other communities at higher risk if they can't afford a levee. Dams are also an environmental justice issue. Over a 40-year period, they brought water to 20% of the world's population, but decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. And the receivers may seem lucky, but in fact, they are also put more at risk. There's something called the levee effect, which is when people feel this sense of security when somebody builds a levee, and so more things are built behind it. And water people have a joke about levees. There are two kinds, ones that have failed and ones that are going to fail. So those people are more at risk. And similarly, there's a reservoir effect with dams. More water just increases demand. It increases more business, more agriculture, more homes in an area that doesn't actually have enough water to support that. And lastly, slow water is community facing. In some places I went, the community was actively managing the water in their area. In other cases, it might be more of an educational component where people who come to visit a landscape can understand what the land is doing with water in that area. So slow water projects usually start with historical ecology. Water has a memory. And to deduce what water wants, historical ecologists try to map what used to be there before all of our development to get a sense of where water is inclined to go. So homes built on wetlands are often the first to flood or to have water in their basements when it rains. And that allows cities and counties to make long-term plans. We may think of our landscape as fixed and set, but in fact, buildings turn over pretty quickly over time. And so if you understand water's path, then the city can prioritize making that a space for water instead of authorizing a new building when one comes down that will also be at risk of flooding. So a few examples. In Seattle, I looked at an urban stream restoration project, and many cities around the world have buried or filled in most of their wetlands and streams. Ones that do remain on the surface often look like this. And ecologists call this urban stream syndrome. And these are marked by flash floods, unstable banks, heavy pollution, and not much life. And it kind of followed a process. First settlers came and cut the trees, deforested, water started moving faster, people worried about flooding, so they straightened it to get the water off the land faster, creating this kind of fire hose effect, which then caused a lot of erosion, and so that leads to concrete or sandbags on the banks. And with all of the paved areas, when it rains, all of those pollutants just wash right off really quickly into the creek. So this creek in Seattle called Thornton Creek was flooding regularly, flooding the neighborhood, houses, a school, a road. And so the city decided to try to address that. And over a period of about 20 years, they bought out willing sellers. And typical urban stream restoration has been, putting back in some curves, taking out the pavement, putting in some wood and boulders, kind of making it look habitat-y. But scientists have discovered that this isn't really working. It's not solving flooding, water scarcity, or erosion. It needs really regular maintenance, and the life that's in it is not very diverse. It's sort of a crows and cockroaches situation. So a city biologist named Catherine Lynch realized it's not just the stream that we see. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction there. There we go. But the one that we don't see flowing underneath. And this is called the hyporeic zone, from the Greek, hyporeic, underflow. And so, water moves down into the aquifer, it moves up from the groundwater, but it's also moving downstream, but orders of magnitude more slowly than on the surface because it's moving through soil and rock. And the hyporeic zone is also quite large. On a stream, it can extend 30 feet from the banks. So it's not just the channel you see, but a wide area next to it. And in a big river, it can be a mile from the banks. And in the hyporeic zone live microbes, crustaceans, worms, and aquatic insects. And these critters play a really pivotal role in nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon cycling. It's very much like the stream's gut microbiome. And just like when our gut microbiome isn't very diverse and we get sick, the same thing is true for the stream. So when it's scoured away by this fast water, the stream has very little hope of staying healthy. And so Catherine Lynch, this is her in the front, she convinced the city to do a first in the world attempt to rebuild a hyporeic zone that was missing from an urban stream. It had all been scared away, and to repopulate it with critters from a nearby wilder stream. So this project was, it really benefited from historical ecology. The creek is about 11 miles long, but the projects just occupied 1,600 feet. But they were in the historical floodplains. The reason this area was flooding is because it was a floodplain. So by giving that back to the creek, they have solved the flooding problem in this area. And to convince the decision makers to do this when it had never been done before, she partnered with scientists from the local university to study various aspects to see how effective their project was and to advise them how to do it differently going forward. So they found that on a physical level, water moving down into the hyporeic zone was 89 times greater than before the project. And it has absorbed floods. The stream flows year round because the groundwater is able to supply it from below. The temperature is more constant, which makes it better for various forms of life. They did a biological study to try to figure out who all was living in there. As one of my sources told me, ecologists tend to have this attitude of if you build it, they will come. But as she said, when your headwaters are a Home Depot parking lot, they're not coming. And so that's why they did this inoculation from another stream, sort of like a fecal transplant, if you want to continue the gut analogy. And so they found that the restored sections have 7 times more crustaceans, worms, and insects, and much greater species diversity. They did a chemical study. So non-point source pollution, brake pad dust, lawn fertilizer, things that just run off of our cities into the water without any treatment. They measured 1,900 pollutants in the creek after a rainstorm. And they found that spending 3 hours in a 15-foot stretch of the hyporeic zone reduced 78% of these chemicals by at least half. The city hasn't flooded since they did this project. The neighbors love this area. It's used for parks and education. And Chinook salmon returned and spawned in this hyporheic zone that they created. So now I'll shift to a drier part of the world. And this is from Arizona. And so, I think we're used to the West as being a very dry place, but it wasn't necessarily historically. And many of our activities have caused what California biologist Brock Dolman calls the age of drainage. And that is killing the beavers, cutting the rivers off from their floodplains, draining the wetlands, hard grazing, clear cutting forests. So I did a story for Popular Science that was about two landowners who moved to southern Arizona in the 1980s to a cattle ranch in the Chiricahua Mountains. And they found that the land was severely degraded. The settlers had been really hard on it. They had cut the forests, they had really hard grazed the land. And when the monsoon rains came, there was a torrent that caused massive erosion, and then the water was gone just in a few hours. And so they kind of instinctively built a small little rock dam to try to halt the erosion. And they were inadvertently copying a technique that indigenous people had been using for thousands of years in the Southwest and in Mexico. So this is what their watershed looked like after just a couple of monsoon seasons. They built a lot more of these little rock dams in the headwaters, and the water now flows year-round. So downstream landowners are really suspicious. Oh, they're taking our water. And that's our commodity mindset, right? In the dominant culture, like it's scarce. We don't have enough for everyone. And so Laura Norman, a physical scientist at USGS, was really fascinated by this, and she did a bunch of studies. And she discovered that they actually made their stream produce 28% more water than a neighboring creek that had none of these innovations. And it's because, you have that soft matter that the water can infiltrate, whereas when the water is just flowing right over the bedrock, it is evaporating immediately. So by taking care of the stream is taking better care of the people in that area. And now this strategy is being replicated on various state lands across the Intermountain West. Farah mentioned our friend the beaver, which is another classic way of rehydrating the landscape. And as she alluded, the settlers trapping industry killed millions of beavers, which radically altered the plumbing of North America. 10% of North America was beaver-created wetlands before this happened. And the groundwater table was high, and streams in the West flowed year-round. And we tend to think that beavers create floods, but they also prevent flooding, and that's what they're being used for in England, where a different species of beaver that's quite similar to the North American beaver was extirpated 400 years ago. And so in recent years, people started with, you've heard of guerrilla gardening, where people throw wildflower seeds into an empty lot. They did some guerrilla beavering. Got some beavers from Europe where they still persisted and deposited them into streams in England. And over time, got some permits for official studies, et cetera, and discovered that peak flows are actually 30% lower on average. So the water is still moving through the beaver dam. It's a little porous, but over a longer period of time. It's like flattening the curve in the pandemic. When it's not all going at once, it's not going to overflow the stream in the towns that are nearby. And in droughts, which they actually do have in England, I was surprised to learn, water can stop flowing into the beaver dam and continue to flow from it because of that groundwater storage that the beavers have achieved. Wrong way again. So that's why people in the US West are getting increasingly interested in beavers' return. And so people actually have parachuted beavers into the backcountry in Idaho and in California in the mid-20th century. And that's because people have known for a long time that beavers heal water systems. But in the modern era, Washington State has really led the charge kind of since the 1990s. And one researcher there found that when beavers were reintroduced to a stream, their ponds stored 75 times more water above and below ground per 100 meters of stream than an area without. And in rain-dominated basins, beavers could increase summer water availability by 20%. Now, that's really important in a place where we rely on snowpack for water because our snowpack is melting. So beaver ponds, beaver complexes are another way to hold water on the land and to help recharge groundwater. And another researcher has been doing a lot of studies of beavers and fire because we've had such intense fires in the West. And, you know, it's not just that water doesn't burn, but also because they're raising the groundwater table, the plants have better access to that. And so they are less dry and less likely to burn or to burn severely. So California was kind of late among Western states, but it took a big jump forward in 2022 and funded 5 state-level positions to kind of facilitate the return of beavers, including in collaboration with California tribes who are welcoming beavers back onto their lands. And they're really looking to beavers to support biodiversity, heal water systems, and reduce fires. So on the subject of fires, you know, journalists' coverage of climate change has continued to evolve, and now we hear more about impacts, how climate change is contributing to this storm or this flood or this fire. But one thing that's critically overlooked by journalists and thus policymakers is that it's not just that climate change makes these disasters more intense, it goes the other way too. Water and biology are also affecting climate. So industrial forestry, clear cutting is another major way that we've disrupted the water cycle. And cross-disciplinary scientists are discovering connections among plants, water, and climate that are really intriguing. You know, hotter air increases water vapor in the atmosphere, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas. And so that creates a cycle that makes climate change more intense. And one of the reasons why water is complicated and has sort of been cut out of the climate discussion because of that is that it's also the primary way that Earth releases heat through phase changes, you know, moving from gas to liquid. And our land use practices, we have destroyed natural ecosystems on 75% of land on Earth. So that really amplifies the heating effect and decreases the natural cooling effect. And our age of drainage, erasing water's slow phases, rushing it off the land, pumping it out of the ground is so significant that it's actually contributing to sea level rise. Less water on land, more water in the ocean. And that also makes water less available to form rain from plants and soil as they bring it up from the ground and release it into the air, and contributes to drought. So when trees and plants transpiration condenses into rain, it falls again locally and regionally, which is called precipitation recycling. And scientists used to think that most rain came from evaporation over oceans. But now they understand that evaporation from plants and soil on average contributes to about 40% of the rain that we experience over continents. And it's different in different places. On the East Coast, it's actually 70 or 80%. So what is happening on the landscape west of here is really important. Forests also help to form rain in 2 other ways. The rough surface slows the wind, which helps the kind of particles to stall, and they release little bits of fungal spores, pollen, and bacteria, which all help water condense into rain. And these forest exhalations also feed into jet streams and atmospheric circulations, seeding rain on the other side of the world. Or on the flip side, forest loss can increase drought on the other side of the world. One researcher calls these eco-climate teleconnections. So nature-based solutions are getting more attention, but I fear that a lot of this is suffering from oversimplification as well. We often hear that we're going to plant trees because they store carbon, trillion trees. But these projects almost never consider the water cycle. And instead, that single focus of storing as much carbon as quickly as possible is creating problems. When you have plantations of fast-growing pine or eucalyptus, you can really dramatically impact the local water cycle, taking too much water. And forest researchers have found that it's better to instead spend money protecting an area, letting the forest replant itself, providing alternative livelihoods to people who may have been disrupting that landscape. And restoration done well in this way can improve rivers and underground water flow for miles away. And these intact, healthy ecosystems regulate water and climate best because they evolve together, according to a Russian atmospheric physicist named Anastasia Makareva, who co-created something called the biotic pump theory. And people used to think that temperature differentials between ocean and land pulled water vapor over the land to seed rain. But the biotic pump discovered that forests don't just grow where it rains. In fact, they are actively pulling in the wind to deliver the rain that they need. So water vapor exhaled by a blanket of trees stretching to the coast condenses into clouds. Local air pressure decreases, which then draws in more moist air from elsewhere. This idea is not radical, she told me. All organisms possess knowledge of physical laws that allows them to make use of the environment. We're not surprised when birds build nests. This is Kenya, where I also went in my reporting. And much of the science that I've just told you about trees and the water cycle is really on the cutting edge of Western science. But in Kenya, where I reported for my book, some of these principles are common knowledge. Decades ago, Nobel Peace Prize winner Wangari Maathai said, "If you destroy the forest, then the river will stop flowing, the rains will become irregular, the crops will fail." And when I was in Kenya, I met people who had seen their streams disappear as nearby forests were felled. And forest restoration and water-savvy farming techniques brought them back. So increased frequency and severity of fires is another sign of climate change. But also, as I was saying, industrial logging makes fires worse because it interferes with the water cycle. And this is something that fire reduction policies largely ignore. You know, conventional wisdom is that protected forests that have no logging have a fuel loading problem, hence the need for forest raking. But a study of 1,500 fires in Western US forests over 30 years found that protected forests had lower fire severity, and areas with higher logging had a higher burn severity. So why is that? Industrial logging clear cuts old growth trees that transpire a lot of water, so that reduces rain. It increases local heat because of the role of the water vapor in cooling local areas, as well as shade. It removes the complex networks that allow trees to share resources, the mycorrhizal networks underground. It removes the kind of undergrowth that creates a spongy, moist environment. They often use pesticides to kill non-commercial deciduous species. These are trees that are generally less likely to burn, and it also kills all the life in the soil. And soil with higher organic content can hold orders of magnitude more water. So that's also why you often see landslides after these kinds of dramatic fires. So replacing a primary forest with plantations of one or two commercial species or keeping forests in an early successional state to maximize profits disrupts the community's evolved ability to regulate the water cycle and the climate. And the most important thing people can do to protect their communities, Makareva told me, is to protect old growth forests and connected vegetated lands. Simply stopping their ongoing destruction will slow down climate destabilization. So because we're here on the coast, I want to talk a little bit about a coastal impact of dams that isn't widely known. There's a part of a chapter in my book where I talk about, well, dams and levees, which are kind of what we tend to think of as water management and the various issues with them both. So I'll just go through the dams briefly. They're often considered to be renewable energy, green energy, because they're carbon neutral, because they're not burning anything. But cement is actually the source of 8% of global emissions. There's a high methane footprint from decaying vegetation from the reservoir. And the actual accounting of dams, in fact, it can take 10 to 15 years for the dam to offset how much a fossil fuel plant is burning. They have also been considered to be, well, let me first, they flood important cultural sites. They block fish passage. That's why 2,000 dams have come out in the US. The Klamath dams in the West are coming out this year, and hundreds in Europe. And yet there are 58,000 big dams worldwide and 3,700 more planned, mostly in Asia, Africa, and South America. So why? One reason is that they are considered reliable baseload power. But that's less and less true. Zambia and Mozambique have gotten almost all of their electricity from dams. And when they had a massive drought about 10 years ago, the economy just completely shut down because there was no power at all. And in fact, Canada is big on dams as well, and typically export power to the US, but there's a big drought happening in Western Canada right now, and it's having to import power because it can't rely on hydro. Your electricity bill is actually called the hydro bill in Canada. And so there is a lot of environmental injustice with dams as well. So the Mekong River is a site of a lot of dam building, and 60 million people there get most of their protein from fishing. And Cambodia actually put a moratorium on dam building for a while because it realized the government was going to have to provide that protein to people through fish farms or something, and it was just too complicated and too expensive. They are no longer holding to that moratorium, which is another story, but electricity often goes to richer neighboring countries. So a dam in Guyana might power Brazil, a dam in the Congo is going to power diamond mines in South Africa. And they block sediment from reaching the coast, which is a big issue, especially with sea level rise. But even without it, you have the tides that are kind of constantly eroding the coast. So you need the sediment to constantly be feeding the coast. And when you don't have that, like Louisiana, you lose lots and lots of land over a very quick period of time, geologically speaking. So a study of more than 400 rivers over 40 years found that they blocked 49% of sediment to coasts in the Northern Hemisphere. And that might even be greater because they started the study in the 1980s and a lot of dams were built in the 70s, so their baseline was already altered. That previous dam was Kariba Dam, which is on the border of Zambia and Zimbabwe. This is a story I wrote for Nautilus magazine, and it looked at this other unexpected impact of dams on oceans. So their negative impacts carry out into oceans. River plumes of fresh water can extend 80 miles out into the sea, and the nutrients that they carry are really critical to ocean food webs. Ocean currents actually meander back and forth like streams do on land. And the collision of the fresh water with the denser, colder salt water destabilizes these natural meanders, which causes kind of a chain of eddies. And those affect larger ocean circulation patterns. So fresh water being less dense tends to remain on the surface, and it's easier for wind to move it. So when you have less water, when dams are blocking that fresh water or they're releasing it at a scale that is not what nature is expecting, the winds have to work harder to move the water, and that slows the currents. And that can create a food bust at the base of the food chain. And the researchers for this study were looking at the South China Sea, where fishing is not only a food issue, but also a geopolitical issue. The Southern Hemisphere has many fewer dams at this point, and a lot more recent deforestation. So researchers actually found increased sediment in those areas, which causes other problems such as too much algae. And it's possible that the sargassum explosion that we've been seeing in the Atlantic in recent years could be due to this. So these are the Chinese and UK and North American editions. Sooner or later, water does always win. And communities who are letting go of that impulse for control and instead approaching water with a sense of curiosity listening, a willingness to collaborate, can make themselves more resilient. And I've seen that in many cases, including Peru, which I wish I had included here, but I could tell you more about that later if you're interested. One last thing, our economic system is also very single focused. So if we're thinking about building a levee to protect a particular community, we're looking at, does this levee for this amount of money protect this community to this degree? We're not counting, is it going to increase flood risk for these people over here? We're not looking at, is it going to destroy the base of the food web on this floodplain, et cetera. And nor are we counting all the benefits of these slow water projects, which protect against flood and drought simultaneously. They store carbon dioxide. They are the base of the food chain. They are habitat for critters. And, I believe that other species have a fundamental right to exist. But even if you're looking at it from a selfish perspective, those critters, it's not just home for them. They are actively managing that environment and keeping it functioning. And without them, we don't have that. So this is my website with more information. And I think, what I took away from reporting this book is climate change feels really overwhelming. And I think a lot of people feel like, we're waiting for international decision makers to do things, and there's nothing that we can do. But what I found is that the people that I met in reporting my book, they have a real sense of empowerment and coming together with other people in their own communities. And they can actually make their own communities more resilient to drought and flood. And in buffering themselves from water extremes, they're also slowing climate change. They can start small with a project in their own area. And these projects are cumulative. Every little bit helps, and every additional bit helps more. It's like how solar panels on everyone's roof can add up to a lot of electricity. And I think to the journalists here, climate has been reduced to carbon in the global conversation, but restoring landscapes to heal the water cycle is also necessary to stabilize climate. And that's not currently part of the mainstream conversation, and it really needs to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. So we do have a bit of time for questions. So we'll start with questions in the room. If you have any, feel free to raise your hand. And my colleague, Erica, Erica, I'm looking at Erica, Emily Kribas, will bring this fancy little red box to you, and you just have to talk into it. So do we have any questions? Anyone? One of our fellows, Amanda. And again, if you're on the live stream and you have questions, please put them into the chat and we will take them at the end.
Okay, I'm not, okay. Oh, look, that's how that works. So Erica, first of all, thank you so much for sharing. This was really inspiring. And one thing that I was thinking, so you have been to so many places that you have found different relationships to water, right? And also different ways in which water moves and different things that water wants. But what I would really want to understand a little bit better, maybe you can tell us, is what similar solutions you have found in these places. Because I think that one thing that for me personally, as a journalist and as a solutions journalist, I always try to look for community-based solutions that could be replicated in other places. So I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole book is a solutions book. All of the places I went, I chose because they were people who were doing something really positive in their relationship with water. And I mean, the example I gave in Seattle is one of them. Sorry, what was your question?
Sorry, I wanted to find some similarities.
Oh, yeah.
Like if
So-
there's something
Yeah.
that came
Yeah,
up.
so when I was planning the book, I thought a lot about this because I'm from California where we have drought and flood. And so I wanted to find examples because every area is different and every place has unique geology, ecology, and culture. So I wanted to find places that were experiencing drought, places that were experiencing flood, places that had melting glaciers, rural places, urban places. And the idea was that anyone could find something in the book that had some similarity to their own place that could give them some ideas and a place to start. And the slow water concepts that I listed are some of the commonalities that I found among all of these projects, those kinds of systems thinking, community facing or community built, environmentally just, et cetera.
Any other questions here in the room? Right here. And then Emily will come down here to the lady in purple.
Sorry, don't want the Metcalf fellows to steal all the limelight because we've got to talk to you yesterday and we talked about this a little bit yesterday. Thank you so much for talking. It was great to get to expand upon what we talked about at dinner yesterday. We've been talking a lot about the role or lack of role that Indigenous people play in some of these solutions. A lot of whether they're playing an active role or not, often they're, like you said, their ideas are being used. And I'm curious about how well you think the entities, if they're not the governments themselves made up of Indigenous people, incorporating Indigenous people in these decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, Peru was an interesting example because it focuses on Lima, the city where 10 million people live, but it's a very arid desert plain and they get all of their water from the mountains. And the people who live in the mountains are indigenous farmers. And they have a 1,400-year-old system called amunas by which they take water during the wet season and infiltrate it into these natural infiltration basins. And then it moves through the ground much more slowly and emerges from springs downstream. So by doing that, they extend their water availability into the dry season. And there were 3 villages at the time I visited that had kept up that practice and still had a communal farming culture. And scientists and people in the city, and I think, in Peru, what they say is like everybody is part indigenous, at least. And so the people I met who are leading the utilities and the government in Peru also identified in that way. And, they decided that they passed a law that required utilities to invest in the watershed. So part of everybody's water bill goes to these projects up in the mountains, restoring the amunas where they had been degraded. There is also an ecological component. There's a special wetland up there called Bufadales, cushion bog, and those have been targeted by peat thievery for the nursery trade, and so they were protecting and restoring those. And so the money was going into these projects, which was a recognition of the connection of the upstream water producers, they call them, and the downstream water users. And so the people I met, the comuneros in the villages, were very excited by the support for this tradition and the ability to expand it. There was funding that came with that. And yeah, I think every situation is different, and it's definitely difficult. But the water was still benefiting the farmers. It's just that because they're upstream, after they use it, it's going to go underground and ultimately be in the river. So it's also extending the water season in the city as well. So in that situation, it was a win-win.
This is a very unique microphone. Hi, I'm Chris Woodside. I was actually
hi,
a fellow
Chris.
at Metcalf years ago. Hello, Erica. And I was on the advisory board for years, and it's This is such a great thing, Metcalf. I just wondered if you could elaborate a little more on the idea of planting trees deliberately, and they're not just carbon sticks. That was so intriguing because a lot of people feel if you just plant a tree, you're going to solve a lot of problems. And
Yeah.
maybe you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, even so many tree planting projects are so carbon focused that they are focused, as a plantation of a single species, because they're like, oh, pine trees grow really fast, they'll store more carbon, so let's do that. And as aside from the issue that it may not live because it may be susceptible to disease or fire, there's also the water issue. But even when people are planting mixed native species, like trying to approximate a native forest, oftentimes those maybe don't have long-term beneficial results as well, because really like the land knows what plants it needs. And so if you have an adequate seed bank in the soil, which a lot of places do, they find often you have a lot more success if you use that money to give to people for alternative livelihoods. So if people have moved in there to deforest and farm, and then, maybe like in Kenya, they were getting them involved in beekeeping, for example, and then also like conservation of that area. And I mean, it is a hard thing to communicate because people love to do something. I mean, that's part of why gray infrastructure has been so big, is like, you can build something and cut a ribbon, and trees, you can plant them. And, in Kenya, like a lot of the tree planting that's happening is involving local people and paying local people. So there are people who are growing the baby trees to plant out. There are a lot of women who are involved in planting. And, that forest, the picture that I showed from Kenya, was actually a denuded recent place where people had moved in to clear cut and farm. And that was like 10 years of restoration, that incredibly lush forest picture. I don't know if I really answered your question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sorry. We are at 4:35. Are there any, Phoebe, are there any questions from YouTube? Past that red box.
Thank you. So I am speaking on behalf of Paul Rosselli, from the president of the Burrillville Land Trust. He says, you mentioned that the focus on climate change is not on landscape destruction or water use. Why is that?
That's a complicated question that I can't fully answer at this time, but decades ago in climate science, there was definitely an acknowledgement of the water cycle aspect of climate. And water is tricky because it can heat or cool. Clouds have been very difficult to model. A lot of the climate knowledge that we have comes from modeling. There are a lot of complexities, and scientists have continued to work on that and have continued to try to figure it out and have made some progress. But in the kind of communication of it got sort of pruned out. And so that's how we've gotten to this place where we are now.
Great. Do we have time for one more?
Do you all have time for one more question? Okay, let's ask one more.
All right. So planning boards and water engineers don't have the authority to look at natural systems holistically. Are there lessons to be learned from other places that can be used in our municipal systems?
Yeah, I've given a lot of talks to water engineers and utility people over the last couple of years. And in some places, people do have more authority to do those kinds of projects. But I think part of it, as one of my sources told me, gray infrastructure has a 150-year head start when it comes to scientific studies and people's awareness of it. But there's a growing and robust field of science that is showing the benefits of nature-based solutions. And I think you often still encounter this kind of attitude of, well, that's nice, but it can't be a significant part of the solution. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of scale. When you think about that 87% of the world's wetlands that we've drained, you start to understand why we need lots of distributed, decentralized small projects like across the landscape. And that's definitely something that people can do in their own cities to contribute. And I think, Peru is an example like where they have actually mandated that kind of thing. I looked at India. In South India, there's a 2,000-year-old system by the Tamil people called the Eri system that, again, they have the monsoon, so they have a long dry season that involved catching water and moving it underground, so it would be available later. And that's something that the modern Tamil people are now starting to re-embrace and restore. So that's another place where people are thinking holistically in that way, like throughout the watershed. And, in the US, there's like watershed-focused water management, like where people are realizing they need to kind of work with nature's jurisdictions, as the San Francisco Estuary Institute has dubbed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure that we could keep asking questions. I'll also just make the note that while we may have 150 years of knowledge about dams and gray infrastructure, we actually have thousands of years of knowledge about how nature and humans can work together in sort of focusing on traditional ecological knowledge. So sometimes traditional Western medicine, Western science sort of gets the nod. And Erica speaks eloquently, writes eloquently in her book about that. So thank you, Erica, so much for your time. And thanks to all of you. And thank you to all of you for joining us and those of you on the live stream. And thank you, President Pralange, for being here today. Just as a reminder, you can still register for our next 2 virtual lectures at metcalfinstitute.org. One will be on June 13th on the Southern Ocean and its effect on the Amazon. And then on June 20th, from my home state, the Great Salt Lake, and the push by scientists and others to restore that lake to its safe levels by 2034. The Great Salt Lake is in danger of dying because of drought. And if you're inspired by the namesake of our today's lecture and want to support Metcalf more, please do that. The last thing I will say is that Erica's wonderful book is on sale in the lobby, and she'll also be doing a book signing. So thank you again, Erica.
Thank you for having me. Good.
I have no idea how this like. Here we go.
Take this off.